Today's tutorial is on a fabulous little piece that was originally written for organ, but then later transcribed for piano. It's one of these pieces that is absolutely beautiful, but less played than many others, so it's a good one to add to our repertoire. I'm also going to show you a very novel way of learning this that I think we can apply in many other different pieces, so stay tuned to the end for that. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. A lot of the repertoire I come across I get introduced to via Pianist magazine, and this is one of them. It's the Prelude from Prelude, Fugue and Variations, originally written for organ by Cesar Franck and then transcribed by Harold Bauer for piano. As always, we'll use my 4-step method, but this time, as I said, with a little bit of a twist. And as always, there's a detailed set of practice notes linked below that you can download for free. So let's start with the basic breakdown. I split it into 5 different sections, and as we'll get into it, you'll see why I've gone with this particular split. So let's look at the first section. Basically, what Franck does is to repeat something 3 times, but each time in a slightly different manner. If we look at the 3 different segments, we can see that they start off the same, but finish ever so slightly differently. Now, I've split each of these segments down into snippets using the same pattern. For each of them, the first snippet is identical, so once we have this, that cuts down the work somewhat. The score I've used in the practice notes doesn't have any pedal markings. The score that came within Pianist magazine, on the other hand, shows very frequent pedal changes. And this does make sense when we think that this piece was originally written for the organ, and the organ doesn't have a sustain pedal, and therefore if we don't hold a note down with our finger, then it isn't sustained. However, the organ does have bass pedals, and therefore it's easy to sustain a bass note for as long as we need simply by not lifting our foot. And this is where that bizarre middle pedal on the piano comes in for us. When used properly, in conjunction with the damper pedal, we're able to sustain that bass note independently of all those pedal changes. So let's have a look at how we do that. Going very slowly, we first play the bass note, next we press the Sostenuto pedal, and as I release my hand, you can hear that it's still sounding. Next, if I press the damper pedal, any subsequent notes will be sustained until I lift that pedal. However, again, once I release the sustain pedal, my original bass note is still there. When we're not used to it, it can be somewhat tricky to coordinate, as we must play the notes we want to capture in the Sostenuto pedal before we press the pedal, which is not like the damper pedal where we can pretty much do it either before, during or after playing the note. So let's look at this first snippet and work on incorporating the Sostenuto pedal. You might first try to do this using only the Sostenuto pedal to get used to pressing this just after playing the bass note. Remember, it has to be pressed before you release the note to jump to the next. Next, start adding the damper pedal. First, add it for only a couple of beats and release it to see if you did manage to capture the bass notes. Sometimes we might think we have it, but in fact we missed it. Of course, if your piano doesn't have a Sostenuto pedal, then simply use a sustain pedal. Here, our option is to use partial pedal to release some of the resonance, just leaving the bottom note to sound. This is one aspect of partial pedaling, that it silences notes more quickly in the upper registers than it does in the lower ones, so it can be extremely effective. Once you're happy with the first snippet, then learn the second using add-on. So first we'll go from the first snippet to the first beat of the second, again trapping the bass note in the Sostenuto pedal, and gradually we'll add notes, including the damper pedal, until we have both snippets together. Now we can work on the next snippet of this segment. A good way to approach this, I found, was to actually simplify it at first by removing the left hand jump. So we play the right hand as written, but just the left hand octaves. Pay real close attention to the fact that the left hand is basically a descending scale here. The right hand also follows a pattern of single notes followed by a 2-note chord. Practice like this until you feel really confident with it. Try playing from the beginning of the segment to the end of the snippet by using the simplified version here. Now we're ready to add in those left-hand jumps. Pay particular attention to where we're jumping from the octave to the same note higher up and where we're jumping from the octave to a different note. Also notice that the first of these extra notes go up and afterwards they come down. You'll see why I'm stressing these tiny details in a moment, but for now, just trust me. A helpful way to practice the initial I have found is to actually imagine that this is in groups of 4 eighth notes rather than groups of 3. I call this the modified time signature later on. By that I mean we convert the first eighth note of each set into a quarter note, so we have much more time to think about the jump. So instead of counting 1, 2, 3, we count 1, 2, 3, 4. Once we can easily manage like this, then we can start practicing as written. For the final snippet, we can again make use of the Sostenuto pedal. I found it actually more comfortable to capture that bottom F sharp with the Sostenuto pedal and take those eighth notes written in the treble clef with my left hand. Make a mental note here that the right hand starts off on a B natural. Now, don't go any further with this first section until you're really secure, and let me explain why. If we look at the remaining segments, we'll see that they both start off with identical first snippets, but then the following ones are extremely similar, but also very different. What I found was that using my normal technique of working on several segments of the same section in my initial practice sessions, I ended up confusing myself. I could never quite remember what notes I needed to play next, and given the left hand was jumping around, I was needing to rely on my memory. By confining myself to just this initial segment until it came good, it made learning the rest much easier. If we then look at this second segment, it starts off in the same way as the first. It's the third and fourth snippets that change. Again, let's look at the third. Note here that the left hand does not follow a descending scale. Rather, it first goes down and then back up again. The right hand follows a similar pattern of single notes plus 2-note chords, but across a different harmony. So first let's work on our simplified version as we did for the last segment. Avoiding the jumps helps us get the harmony cleanly in our fingers. Once we're convinced we can play this segment in this simplified version, we can try starting from the start of the first section itself and see if we can actually play right to the end of this second segment. The reason I advise to do this is because I admit I initially found this tricky. It was almost as if my brain was trying to overwrite things. If that happens, play through with the simplified version, avoiding jumps for both segments. You should find this helps to reinforce our memory. We need to remind ourselves of the little differences we spotted between the two. Next, we have the jumps. We can also practice with the modified time signature as we did earlier. We can see that the jump steps up with each pair, but also in the final 2 beats of this snippet, the left hand plays 2 notes rather than 1. And again, it's reminding ourselves of these tiny differences that will help us. Next, we can add the final snippet of this segment. Here, it's very similar to the final snippet of the first segment. However, our right hand starts a third lower on the G sharp rather than the B, and equally the left hand's a third lower than it was last time. Again, for now, we don't want to move to the final segment of this section. For now, just let's spend time getting these 2 segments fully integrated. We should find we can play them fluently without any hesitation, especially around the left-hand jumps. It might take a day or 2 to do this, and we'll likely need to keep referring back to the score to remind ourselves. However, with a little patient work, it will sink in. Only once we have the 2 together should we start working on the third. I'll not go into this one in detail as exactly the same principles and practice techniques apply. Simply repeat the steps we use for segments 1 and 2 as we learn this. The final snippet is a little different here. I found that in this instance, there's no real need to use the Sostenuto pedal as we can leave our left hand to hold the bass note. Now let's look at the second section. Again, the first two snippets are extremely similar, yet different enough to cause confusion. With each one, the first measure follows a very similar design on the same chords but using different inversions. The second measure of each also has a very similar design but made more awkward here by the fact that the notes are arranged between the hands. We then have a couple of snippets that form a sort of bridge before we then have the same idea we had in the first two snippets repeated again, although of course differently. Again, I found that this kept confusing me, so I was never quite sure what I should be doing. So I opted to limit myself in any individual practice session to what I was going to do. I first worked on only the first snippet of this segment, working first with the same idea of a simplified left hand. However, let's think about this first. The way this is transcribed at first can seem a little counterintuitive. If we look at the accompaniment eighth notes, we have the first of each set written in the bass clef, so presumably to be played with the left hand, and the second in the treble clef, so presumably to be played with the right hand. However, the note written in the treble clef is actually lower than the one written in the bass clef. Thus, if we split between the hands like this, we need to play the right hand over or under the left. I decided that this was overkill and with smaller hands can get somewhat messy. I therefore decided to take both with the left hand. I initially practiced this measure alone with the simplified left hand first and then modified time signature afterwards. In the second measure of this snippet, we also have the notes in the bass stave are actually above those in the treble. This might point to again crossing the hands. However, for me this isn't a great solution. Clearly what Franck is making clear is that the melody is written in the treble stave and the accompaniment written in the bass. Therefore, as long as we voice this as such, there's no need in fact to cross the hands. I've talked about this idea of redistributing between the hands before. We don't always need to follow the way something is written. As long as we can achieve the musical result, that's all we need. To practice this initially, we can work on just playing the melody notes with the hand we've opted to use. So basically, I'm redistributing the treble notes between the two hands. Another way of practicing this is to then play all the notes, however play the melody notes legato and the accompaniment notes staccato. Once we're very familiar, then we can move towards playing normally. As a final step, we can join these two measures together. As I advised in the first section, I'd say initially we should go no further than this snippet. Given the next one is so similar, let's first ensure that we've absolutely no hesitation or trouble playing this one. Now let's look at the second snippet. The first measure uses the same chords as that in the first. The second equally has certain notes written in the bass stave that are above those in the treble. However, when we look carefully, they're not split in the same way. And this is why I said to initially avoid looking at this until we've fully mastered the first. So again, we can work on this first measure omitting the eighth notes and then adding them with the modified time signature. We can then work on the second measure playing only the melody with our chosen distribution, and then the melody legato and accompaniment staccato. Again, we put the two measures together first, and then, before moving forward, work on integrating these two snippets. Finally, we work on the last snippet of the segment. Here the score actually recommends redistributing some of the notes, MG of course meaning main gauche or left hand. You might find it helpful to use the modified key signature trick here too, to initially make a little more time for this crossover. Again, once we're comfortable with it, then let's integrate it with the first two snippets, so we now have our first segment complete. For the second segment, we have all the same challenges, and so we can practice it in exactly the same way as we did the first. Again, we decide on the hand distribution we need to use. I continue to avoid crossing the hands here. If we then look at the next section, then again we have two segments composed of very similar snippets, where each is similar but not identical to the one that preceded it. As we look at the first snippet here, in the first measure we have chords in the right hand. However, interestingly, both the right and left hands use the same accompaniment, eighth notes, just an octave apart. So to practice this, let's first work without these accompanying eighth notes in either hand. Let's then add those in the left hand. Again, we have the option of the modified time signature here. Finally, we can add the right hand eighth notes too in the modified time signature. Then once we're comfortable with all that, we can play in the original time signature. The second measure of this snippet can be practiced in a similar way. We can play only the left hand octaves with the right hand initially, and only later add the eighth notes. Now again, don't move any further forward until you're confident with this snippet. When we come to work on the second snippet, it's again very similar, but a little more complex. In the first measure, our left hand now has a chord of its own to play with the right. We can also notice again that the additional eighth notes are the same in both hands. Another useful thing to notice is that the middle note of each left hand triad is the same. It's an A natural. So we can practice this in the same way. First, let's just play the chords themselves. Next, let's add the right hand eighth notes, and finally the left hand eighth notes. Luckily, the second measure is the same as that of the first snippet, so it should be simple enough for us to combine with our first measure. Again, before moving forward, let's integrate these two snippets so we can play both together comfortably and without hesitation. Now, the next segment is composed of three snippets with the same musical design as each other. Again, we have the fact that the eighth note accompaniment is the same in both hands. Watch out for fingering here. For me, it was sometimes more sense to take the second of the eighth notes in the right hand with the thumb, so repeating the thumb on two consecutive notes. Also, it was sometimes more comfortable to use a different finger, so 2 or 3, for the inner notes. And again, I'd work on them one by one in the same way as before. We wait until we've nailed the first before moving on to the second and so forth. We then integrate progressively as we learn each new snippet. Explore this for yourself nice and slowly and write it in. The same applies to the next section. A very similar design over an evolving harmonic pattern. Again, we can practice this in exactly the same way as before by simplifying and modifying the time signature initially to give us a little less to think about as we work on it. I'd still do this snippet by snippet and integrate as we go. Finally, we have the last section. This brings back the original melody, but now in F sharp minor. Our Sostenuto pedal will come in handy again here. As this is largely in octaves, I'd highly recommend practicing each snippet and integrating each one, playing just the right hand and left hand octaves and omitting the rest. Only once we're really confident that our right hand perfectly knows where it's going should we think about adding in the remaining eighth notes. Again, we do this snippet by snippet and we integrate as we go. Now, as promised, here's my power tip on this. Depending on how long you wish to devote to practicing this each day, you might find the size of the snippets I've given is far too small, especially if we're just working on the first snippet of the first section, for example. Therefore, we'll have a tendency to get bored and want to move forward. However, what we can actually do is, rather than working on one section at a time, we can work on several sections in parallel. And the reason I say this is that the material is sufficiently different that our brains won't get confused. Therefore, for example, we can work on snippet 1 of section 1, snippet 1 of section 2, snippet 1 of section 3, you get the idea. As we progress, we then work on slightly longer parts of each section, as I described in the individual sections in this video. This gives us enough to practice without getting bored of any individual bit. It also avoids the issue of our brains getting confused with playing extremely similar material one after another. I hope you'll enjoy learning this just as much as I did. And for more ideas on splitted and accompaniment between the hands and perhaps when we should and when we shouldn't, you might find this video interesting. And if you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.